So, up to this point, we have talked about the first and second revolutions in this unit. We went over the Renaissance, that rebirth of Europe that saw new culture and arts and wealth coming into European countries. And that secular movement where people started thinking more about life in the here and now. This humanism philosophy where people started to believe they could take inspiration from life and nature happening now instead of having all information being filtered through the church. Then we talked briefly about exploration and its influence, the expansion of trade routes and discovery of new worlds across the Atlantic Ocean. What started out as an initial finding routes to establish trade over in China, India, and the rest of Asia as a whole, a whole new world was found, which started up a competition of interests in deciding who gets what land. The Spanish and Portuguese emerged as the two major world powers, getting control over most of South and Central America, and kickstarted off of the Columbian Exchange, post 1492, where you have produce, livestock, diseases, and people moving across from the New World, the Americas, back to the Old World in Europe. And from that, you have more produce, more people, the growth of cities as more wealth and people start to become common in Europe. You have a pride in nations and nations' powers and in the power of rulers. Worldwide, you have total change of trade patterns and settlements, as well as changing populations. In the New World, populations were decimated by diseases and conquistadors and expeditions. And in the Old World in Europe, population was increasing because of all of that produce. You have the mercantilism idea, where people should get more wealth to become more powerful. And from that, immense leaps and investments into what can help rulers and groups of people and nations become more wealthy and more powerful. And that leads us into this third revolution that we will be discussing at length, the Reformation. It's during this revolution that we have people's minds changing about how they think about religion. Prior to the Renaissance, the church was very wealthy and very powerful. Think about what life was probably like on a daily basis back in medieval Europe. Back when even the Black Plague was going across the countryside. It's a time of immense insecurity and widespread death. In those times, you want to have something to hold on to that gives you hope and security. And at that point, the church is what provided that. They gave hope and security for the afterlife in what you would be eventually going to after your time on this earth had ended. The church also held a monopoly over religion and the Bible. The Bible was only written in Latin. Only the clergy or the church leaders could read Latin, and some of them not even fluently. Normal people who went to the church didn't know what the Bible said, and most certainly didn't know what it meant. The reading and the interpretation was left totally up to the church. And for a while, that was fine. The church had complete control over information concerning the Bible and religion, and the people would just come to church to take of that, to have that check-in and security for what the future would be. But as you get into more of the Renaissance time period, people start to become more aware and more outspoken about the problems that they perceive in the Catholic Church. Because the church was had such a position of power and wealth, it continued to bring that in. People would give donations and would pay tithes to the church to help keep it running and as, forms of good service. But this was extended into people accusing the church of being greedy, of using too much of the people's money for church projects rather than pouring it and using it for other parts of the community. The political power of the church was also being threatened. If you've got you have these absolute monarchs that start to be more prevalent in society, and they stand at opposition with the church. If people have to decide between following a ruler or following a religion, then you start to have some problems that pop up in society. You also have church leaders who were accused of corruption. One instance being this gentleman down here, Rodrigo Borgia, who would eventually become Pope in 1492. He was notoriously known in this time for having 7 different illegitimate children, as well as favoritism to his relatives, the Borgia family. He would put family members in positions of power in the church in different levels, whether or not they were qualified. In addition, you had the majority of Europe's population becoming anti-clerical, becoming anti-church leader. Part of this was because the church was set up as like a hierarchy. The Pope was at the top and made all of the ultimate decisions for the rest of the Catholic Church. Then you would have cardinals, archbishops, and bishops in different other layers below who would take care of other regional or local churches. But Europe is pretty large for a region, especially without modern transportation. So any information that was made took a lot of time to get transported. And in a lot of cases, you have local leaders making decisions based upon their own information and without any real oversight from higher ups in the church. They would just be allowed to do what they thought was right. And a lot of people found issue with this. There wasn't anybody holding these people accountable. And one of the biggest things that caused a lot of outspoken conflict was controversy over indulgences. Indulgences were another way for the church to get income. They were essentially a get out of hell free card. You would come to the church or a leader in the church and you would pay money and receive essentially a certificate or a token that was symbolic of cutting down time in purgatory or staying out of hell. With early Catholic doctrine, they believed purgatory was a place you went after death, kind of in between living and heaven. You would spend time there to get better, to do more good works before finally ascending and going to heaven. And you could get these for yourself, for a family member, or for even family members that had been dead already. It was another way of providing security for the future, for the afterlife, but it got to be it got to be very controversial. Take a look at this German certificate down here, signed by Johann Tetzel. He'll come into play later too. But it says, "In the authority of all the saints, and in compassion towards you, I absolve you from all sins and misdeeds, and remit all punishment for 10 days. That essentially says you can do whatever you want and you won't get in trouble for it for 10 whole days. And a lot can happen in 10 days. It was a very kind of skewed dynamic rich people who are better off could very easily buy these and essentially get a free pass to do whatever they wanted because, hey, God still loves me even if I do this thing. I paid for it. Whereas people who are on the lower parts of society, lesser, didn't have as much money, would be scrounging together whatever they could to purchase these for themselves or family members alive or dead as an extra piece of security. And so you have a very split kind of social use in these things. And it was a combination of indulgences and the prior kind of corruption and greed charges that pushed these desires for change in religion. But you also had people's minds that were changing culturally and spiritually.